they're just deep enough into the Ja Morant life cycle. You know, they're young enough. They should have plenty of runway. But again, in this league, you never have as much runway as you think you're going to have. There's always a little bit that's going on below the surface too. So I would just I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not saying it should happen.
There's no question about it. The Luka Doncic trade was one of the most shocking trades in NBA history. And as a result of this trade occurring, I think fans are now not as surprised to hear some of the NBA's biggest stars being mentioned in trade rumors. This latest one is a little bizarre, and I'm going to bring you every single piece of information about it, whether it makes sense, why the Memphis Grizzlies would do it, why they wouldn't do it, and what the general manager actually had to say about it. So before we get to the content, we have a brand new venture. We're creating a baseball channel called Uni Diamond Talk. We're giving away 10 copies of MLB The Show 25 to a subscriber that turns on their notifications on that channel. And now that we get all of that out of the way, cue the intro. We've been on an amazing streak on Prize Picks, making $400 off of our last 3 picks, which proves that my data analysis model works. Sign up for Prize Picks using my promo code microphone to get $50 when you make a play of $5, and follow my Instagram at TheFlightMike to see my plays. I also give away additional plays on patreon.com/microphone, and thank you Prize Picks for the sponsor. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? The Luka Doncic trade was a trade that was so bizarre, so shocking that it literally caused Maverick fans to protest on the streets. Fans are chanting "Fire Nico" in the middle of Mavericks games, and as a result are getting escorted out of the game. We actually covered one of the fans that got kicked out of a Mavericks game in our last video on the Luka Doncic trade. But as a result of this trade occurring, trades that once seemed impossible don't really seem as impossible anymore. And in this particular case, we have a new trade scenario that was mentioned by a fairly respected columnist. On Howard Beck's podcast On The Ringer, an NBA executive pegged Ja Morant as a star to keep an eye on as a potential trade candidate this summer if the Memphis Grizzlies flame out early once again.
Somebody out of the blue said, keep an eye on Ja this summer. They're just deep enough into the Ja Morant life cycle, and also the Ja, Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr. grouping, and you know, they're young enough. They should have plenty of runway. But again, in this league, you never have as much runway as you think you're going to have. And Ja's obviously had some issues. Everything's been fine for a while here, so not to overplay stuff from a year and a half, 2 years ago. But at a certain point, teams will pivot, and you know, there's always, for everything we know publicly, there's always a little bit that's going on below the surface too. So I would just I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not saying it should happen. I'm just saying it's one of those things I'm just kind of keeping an eye on if they were to flame out early.
Now, the basis of this entire video isn't,
oh, the Dallas Mavericks were willing to give up on Luka Doncic, so therefore the Memphis Grizzlies might be willing to give up on Ja Morant.
Rather, this is more of a video where we discuss scenarios where it makes sense for Ja Morant to get traded. Now, in order for this trade to occur, you have to look at the parallels between the Memphis Grizzlies and the Dallas Mavericks. Luka Doncic was able to take the Dallas Mavericks all the way to the NBA Finals, only to get traded 8 months later, right before the NBA trade deadline for Anthony Davis. We know the reason for this. Nico Harrison didn't believe that Luka Doncic had what it takes to be one of the greatest NBA players of all time, despite him making 5 All-NBA appearances, primarily because he had issues with his conditioning, and he felt like his calf strain was a result of Luka Doncic not being in shape. But there is one stark difference between the trade that the Mavericks made for Luka Doncic versus what the Memphis Grizzlies are doing in this particular instance. In the case of Luka Doncic, the Mavericks came out of nowhere and just traded him for Anthony Davis. They didn't shop him around. They could have easily gotten an offer that would have paid minimum 8 future first-round picks for one of the top young stars in the NBA. Victor Wembanyama may have been the only player that is more valuable to trade for than Luka Doncic. You can make a valuable argument for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as well, But at the end of the day, there's no question about it. If you asked anyone in the NBA who is a future star in this league, who is a future MVP in this league, a lot of fans would say Luka. In the case of the Memphis Grizzlies and Ja Morant, the one parallel you could draw here is a little bit of a stretch. You could say that Ja Morant has had a history of very strange off-the-court instances, primarily with waving around a weapon multiple times on his Instagram story, and the lawsuit that involved him allegedly beating up a minor at his own home. At the same time, that isn't strong enough because that happened years ago, which brings us to probably the most legitimate reason as to why the Memphis Grizzlies would trade Ja Morant, and that's simply because they could and still become a contender. Here's the thing, if you go back to the 2022 NBA season, the Memphis Grizzlies have finally arrived as a superpower in the NBA. Ja Morant was in the midst of his best season of his career, averaging 28 points per game, shooting 34% from three, and averaging 7 assists per game, cementing himself as a future face of the NBA. Problem was that Ja Morant would also have his most injury-riddled season at the time, only playing in 57 games. Despite Ja Morant missing 25 games during the 2021-22 season, Memphis was still able to go 20-5 without Ja Morant in the lineup, primarily because of the depth behind Morant. You saw players like Dillon Brooks step up, but at the same time, you saw Tyus Jones really taking a command of the offense and establishing himself as one of the best backup point guards in the entire NBA. It's not like the Grizzlies were better without Ja Morant, but clearly they were just fine without Ja Morant. But the problem was, this is not the same Grizzlies team. Tyus Jones now is the starting point guard for the Phoenix Suns. Dillon Brooks is now a member of the Houston Rockets. In the summer of 2023, the Memphis Grizzlies tried to replace Tyus Jones and Dillon Brooks' production with Marcus Smart, who was supposed to pretty much be the hybrid between those two roles, but that was a colossal failure. Marcus Smart had a very solid first season in Memphis, averaging 14.5 points per game. The problem was that he only played in 20 games in that first year, eventually getting injured for the remainder of the season. And when he came back during this past year, his stats regressed mightily, averaging 8.7 points per game off of an abysmal 36% shooting from the field that eventually resulted in him getting traded to the Washington Wizards. So it's clearly not the same exact team this year. And when you take a look at the Memphis Grizzlies' record last year, they were historically bad without Ja Morant. Which brings us to this past year. The Grizzlies didn't necessarily have the most exciting offseason, primarily because they were more focused on managing the salary cap. During the 2024 trade deadline, they traded Steven Adams to the Houston Rockets. They traded Zaire Williams this past summer as well. They brought back Luke Kennard on a fairly cheaper contract, and they were able to stay below the luxury tax. Their main problem going into the offseason was the lack of center depth, so they drafted Zach Edey. Despite having a fairly underwhelming offseason, the return of Ja Morant was enough to catapult the Memphis Grizzlies to the top of the Western Conference, where at the time that we're recording this video, they're currently 36-18, but once again, Ja Morant suffered through injuries. Although it wasn't nearly as bad as in years past, Ja Morant would miss 22 games, and in those 22 games, the Grizzlies would be 14-8 without him, which brings us to why the Memphis Grizzlies would potentially make this trade, and the very first reason is because Ja Morant has regressed mightily from his peak. During the 2021-22 season, Ja Morant averaged 27 points per game off of 49% shooting from the field and 34% shooting from three. This past year, he's averaging 20.7 points per game, shooting 32% from three and 45% from the field. If you go into his advanced metrics, during the 2022-23 season, he had an offensive box plus minus of a 5.2. He had a defensive box plus minus of a 0.5, a value over replacement player of a 3.8. But this year, he has an offensive box plus minus of a 2.9, a defensive box plus minus of a negative 0.3, a value over replacement player of a 1.1. His player efficiency rating is the lowest it's been since his second year in the NBA with a 19, which isn't really a stat that I firmly go by, but the one thing that nobody's talking about is the fact that Ja Morant has regressed, and the injuries are also piling up. So if the general manager of the Memphis Grizzlies, Zach Kleiman, doesn't have faith in Ja Morant being able to stay healthy, or if he thinks he's going to consistently regress and the injuries are going to get worse and worse, plus the Memphis Grizzlies are doing fine just without Ja Morant, then why wouldn't you trade Ja Morant for the haul that Luka Doncic could have gotten you? Let's take a look at the recent trades for fringe all-stars, for instance. In the summer of 2022, the Utah Jazz traded Rudy Gobert for Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Leandro Bolmaro, Walker Kessler, Jared Vanderbilt, 4 first-round picks, and a pick swap. Of course, you guys remember this past offseason, the New York Knicks traded Bojan Bogdanovic, Shake Milton, 4 unprotected first-round picks, an unprotected pick swap, a top 4 protected first-round pick, and a second-round pick for Mikal Bridges. But the trade that I think would be more similar to what Ja Morant's trade would be was the second trade that the Utah Jazz made in the summer of 2022, where the Cleveland Cavaliers sent Lauri Markkanen, Ochai Agbaji, Colin Sexton, 3 unprotected first-round picks, and 2 pick swaps for Donovan Mitchell. In this particular instance, the Grizzlies are in a remarkable situation because 1, they're still above average without Ja Morant playing. 2, Ja Morant has regressed mightily. And 3, there's a team that would bite on Ja Morant because he is 25 years old. You could at the very minimum net yourself 5 future first-round picks while still being competitive for the foreseeable future. The way that this would differ from the Luka Doncic trade is, unlike the Luka Doncic trade, the Memphis Grizzlies are doing something that Nico Harrison didn't do. And that's the fact that they're already putting feelers out. These rumors don't just come out of nowhere. These rumors are typically NBA teams trying to gauge the interest of their star players. And when you consider the fact that Ja Morant has regressed as a player this past year, plus the fact that this rumor is coming out of nowhere, Ja Morant is still under contract for the foreseeable future, and it's not that bad of a contract either, then this is a very legitimate possibility. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't inform you that Zach Kleiman has come out and said that these rumors are nonsense. And that's according to Drew Hill. I reached out to Grizzlies GM Zach Kleiman to see if he would comment about the recent speculation around Ja. And here's what he had to say. I can't blame other executives for fantasizing about us trading Ja, but it's just that, fantasy. We are not trading Ja. Continue to underestimate Ja, this team, in this city, and we will let our performance on the floor speak for itself. I'm not going to give this nonsense further oxygen, and I look forward to getting back to basketball. But here's the thing, if you're a team that is clearly hitting a wall during the Ja Morant era, if you're struggling to get past the first round of the NBA playoffs with Ja Morant in the lineup, and there's a move that needs to be made in order to take the next step, and you've already been an above average team without Ja, now you could add multiple assets and maybe a high value role player onto your roster as well, while capitalizing on the peak of Ja's value. Why wouldn't you? At the end of the day, I don't expect any general manager to come out and say,
Yeah, we're planning on trading this player eventually.
no general manager would do that. But at the same time, no general manager would trade one of the biggest stars in the NBA for Anthony Davis, Max Christie, and a 2029 first round pick without gauging the value of said star player with other teams. This is the Memphis Grizzlies trying to do that, in my opinion. Now, obviously, such a trade can't happen right now. It'll probably happen in the offseason. It might happen next trade deadline even. But at the end of the day, a huge thing to remember is this type of trade wouldn't be like what we experienced with De'Aaron Fox. Ja would have no leverage on the Memphis Grizzlies, which would maximize their return if they were to move on from him. I honestly think it's a brilliant move, and Ja Morant could elevate already contending teams. I mean, for instance, the Houston Rockets have a plethora of assets and young stars that they could trade for Ja Morant. I don't think it would happen with the San Antonio Spurs now that they got De'Aaron Fox, but the Orlando Magic are another team that could potentially take a flyer on Ja Morant as well, primarily because Ja Morant very much thrives in an environment where he gets to drive and kick, and then you have Paulo Banchero, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and Franz Wagner on the perimeter. The New Orleans Pelicans are headed for a rebuild, and based off of how healthy Zion Williamson is, maybe they can add Ja Morant to play with Zion Williamson, or maybe they could even trade Zion Williamson and some future capital for Ja Morant, but I think that's a bit more of a long shot. The top team I would say that could trade for him would be the Miami Heat, but the problem is that the Miami Heat are consistently in these rumors, and they never really get any star player that they're involved in rumors with. I mean, whether it's Damian Lillard, Donovan Mitchell, Kevin Durant, and Kyrie Irving, who literally said they wanted to go there, the Miami Heat never pull the trigger on anything. So let me know in the comment section down below, what do you think about this rumor? Because it is a very unique rumor. Some fans think it's BS. I actually think there's some validity to it. Maybe in a year from now, I'm tweeting this on X and I'm saying, I told you there's some validity to it, but I like to hear what you have to say. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.